Ken Masson. I am the president of the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy, which is a group that focuses on the human rights for people with disabilities on a global level. And today we're going to be talking about education, and we have with us a fascinating person who's a club member, Mr. Sigamoney. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can you pronounce your whole name for me? So, because I'm going to not do a good job if I did.
No, that's fine. I think you did a good job. It's Sigamoney Naicker, and yep.
Okay, so now my next question, I'm going to sit back and just listen because I'm going to learn more about you. So, tell me about yourself.
Okay, so I'm South African, and I grew up in a so-called Indian township. If you're familiar with South Africa, you know what Indian means. That means that my ancestors came from India, and so we were all put into different areas. And in apartheid days, South Africa had segregation, had this policy of apartheid, and I grew up in this township. And it was tough and it was rough, but I eventually got to university, and I studied, and I learned at university that education is the most powerful weapon, as Nelson Mandela said. It's the most powerful tool, and that you need to liberate your mind. So I just did that. And then I got a scholarship to the United States, and I studied at Penn State College. And I came back and did my doctorate in South Africa. And I got an extraordinary professorship from the university, but I served I was the national director of inclusive education in South Africa. And I was the chief director of inclusive education here in the Western Cape, which is where Cape Town is. And while in the system, I realized that because of my working class background and because of the way I educated myself, I realized there was something fundamentally wrong with the education system. That what it does is it selects and rejects. And that applies across the board. And so I decided, when I realized this, to study the education system, to study the people in the education system, to study the policies in the education system, and then look at international research. Look what's happening in the UK, look what's happening in the US, look what's happening in other countries in the world. And I developed a narrative which calls into question the status quo. And so I wrote a book called Education and the Working Class: Is There Hope for an Inclusive Education System? And so, we often criticize people, we often criticize policy, but we don't put a counter narrative. So I've made the first step. I put a counter narrative that challenges the status quo and calls the status quo into question. But my work is unfinished. And so I'll be working mainly in the African continent, academically and theoretically, to advance an inclusive pedagogy. Can I stop there, Ken?
Oh, yeah, I have a million questions just about what you said. But can you define what you're talking about education? Are you talking about like public school system? Or are you talking about higher education?
Well, I'm talking about the educational narrative in the world today. The education narrative in the world today is commodified, it's politicized, and it's personalized, because you get certain personalities that don't ask questions, but that want to advance their careers and are very materialistic and want to live a high quality lifestyle. But the nature of the bureaucracy is such that the bureaucracy controls the narrative. So if it's politicized, It's a political narrative. And if it's commodified, it believes not in the best interest of the child, but looks at the economic decisions in economic terms. So when I talk about education, I'm talking about education broadly in the world, although I contextualize the narrative that I have developed within the South African context. Because what I'm saying is not irrelevant to what is happening in the United States. It's not irrelevant to what's happening in the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, by the way, they don't use the term working class. They use some other term that the government has developed. But I don't want to go there. I just want to say that education is about love and humanity. It's about respecting the dignity of people. And it's about love and caring and educare. And unfortunately, in the world today, too many children are outside the mainstream of education. And they're outside the mainstream of education because of politics, because of economics, and because of personalities, not because of educational theory and practice.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. So tell me, what is the working class?
So you see, the working class is highly differentiated, right? Depending on the context you are in. But for us, what is very important is to understand um, the working class by looking at the characteristics of working class communities. Single parents, high alcohol consumption, drugs in the community. Although you do get drugs and alcohol in middle class communities, but it's far worse in working class communities. There isn't a culture of intellectual culture of reading and writing. There isn't a socialization into intellectual culture. There isn't a emphasis on academic work. And so uh, that's how I understand working class. And if you look at those characteristics, you'll find them all over the world in poor communities.
So in economic terms, is the working class the poor class?
Yeah, it is children who come from homes that are not well resourced. Now, for example, if you look at the United States, you have the uh, zip codes. So someone coming from Harlem or someone coming from Detroit or someone coming from the ghettos in Baltimore would have a very different lifestyle and a socialization into intellectual work compared to the elite areas in New York, the elite zip codes in New York, the elite zip codes in Detroit, and the elite zip codes in any other place in the world. In the United Kingdom, you have the school ranking system, and so the best schools, well, I don't want to call them the best schools, but the best performing school, according to the criteria laid down by the system, uh, are elite communities. Communities come from elite backgrounds. So working class kids would come from poor communities where there is a lack of socialization, support, is lack of socialization, intellectual culture, lack of support, and so on. And what Pierre Bourdieu refers to this as is cultural capital. So the cultural capital of someone coming from a extremely well-performing school in the UK that's ranked, it doesn't mean that's the best school. It means that those parents have the resources to nurture the children and even get tutors to support them. But in the poor communities where there's a lack of cultural capital, lack of parental involvement, a lack of socialization into intellectual culture, the children struggle.
Mhm.
But some schools, despite all the odds, children succeed in those schools. And in my opinion, the best schools are the schools that are able to uh, create conditions for success in communities where children really struggle.
Mhm.
So, so I think that is why I think that education can compensate in terms of cultural capital by strengthening the foundation phase, building resilience. But you have to understand those communities, and the pedagogy that we use in schools must emerge from those communities. It can't emerge from someone sitting in a boardroom writing out a curriculum that's middle class, that's never lived in a township, and doesn't understand what happens in
Mhm.
townships. And that is why schools in the UK and schools in the United States and schools in South Africa are reproducing social inequality. And this has been well documented across the world.
Okay, interesting. And of course, when we talk about working class, sorry, um, it's so different on a global level. The working class in the United States and the working class in Nigeria are totally different concepts of what you're talking about. Um, so there's a vast, I mean, we think on a global level, and I know you're going to try to travel the world and get your message across on a global level, which is good. But I mean, in some countries, single mother, could basically worry about how am I going to pay for the meal today. Um, so getting her child to school, sometimes she doesn't even bring her child. And I'm thinking, of course, too, with children with disabilities, it's even worse in that situation. And of course, that has nothing to do with their education. Anyway, I ramble. So let's talk about what is inclusive education.
So I don't think you ramble, Ken. I think you ask good questions. And so just on what you said, before I answer what is inclusive education, I think this is the point. The point is inclusive education. So before Salamanca and before uh, people who were constructed as uh, disabled or people who are constructed in a particular way were put into special schools. So when we had a national commission in South Africa, the people who came out of the special schools said that they didn't really benefit from the service delivery in special schools. So I thought about this and I wrote a book at that stage called Curriculum 2005, An Introduction to Inclusive Education, A Space for All. And the reason why I wrote that book was I realized in those 18 months of the commission's work, I was one of the commissioners appointed to work on this team. I realized that special education is a medical construction, but it is also a social construction. It's been constructed by people who had vested interest in a system that benefited them. So don't get me wrong. I think there are some wonderful people working in the area of special education and working with children who are said to have certain disabilities and so on. But this whole thing is a social construction. It's based on the medical model. And I think that aren't many countries in the world that have inclusive systems. So when you ask me what is what is inclusive education, inclusive education happens when the barriers to learning are removed and a child is able to interact with the curriculum in any school, anywhere in the country. So then we have to ask the question, why are children taken out of the neighborhood school, grows up in a community, cannot go to the neighborhood school, goes to some school that's 5 or 6 kilometers away in a bus? I think it's totally unfair and wrong. because someone has taken the decision. It is once again a social construction. It's decided by people based on some policy written somewhere that that child cannot go to the neighborhood school. We need to reconstruct our understanding of what education is. Education is about embracing diversity in every classroom in the world. And so it is a curriculum problem. We need to reconstruct the curriculum and ensure that we make it accessible to every learner. So there's multiple forms of expression and there's multiple forms of learning, and so that there is diversity built into how we understand the curriculum.
And oftentimes, when that child is moved to another, go to school in another community, that decision is made by a politician who knows nothing about like education.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, um, so yeah, again, inclusive education, and in my learning all this, is any child. Because for me, it was always children with disabilities, which of course it is. Yeah, but it's inclusive is for everybody at this point. And you're saying it's not inclusive, the education system.
Because I don't believe that, based on the philosophy of inclusion, that any country in the world has changed its philosophy that influences every policy in the country to make it inclusive, because you have inclusive education being implemented with concurrent policy, and those concurrent policies are exclusive because inclusive education came in at a particular time and at a particular context. So, number one, the philosophy hasn't changed sufficiently in any education system in any country in the world. I want to see a country that has implemented the philosophy at a policy level. The second issue is that the philosophy, therefore, has not impacted on the structure and the way the department is run across the world. The Department of Education is run across the world. There's no relationship between the philosophy and the structure. There has to be, because if you want to create an inclusive system, you have to change the philosophy, you have to change the structure, and that structure will ultimately influence the practices. And when they influence the practices, they'll make sure that no child is left out of the neighborhood school. And so nobody can say to me that this is an expensive venture, because there's so much of money being put into special education, but there isn't an imagination in bureaucracies across the world, because bureaucracies don't get paid for imagination and creativity. They get paid to reproduce the status quo. That's our problem.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your book. You obviously, because of your passion for the subject, decided to write this book. Um, and what is in that book? Tell me about what's in that book.
So,
So let me give you the title again: Education in the Working Class.
is the hope for an inclusive system.
Okay. So what? Tell
Education
me
in the
about
working
what's in
class.
that book. What if I buy the book? What am I going to?
Well, uh, I think the most important message that I want to provide in this book is that, because of my working class background and because of the alienation my family and I and people like myself have felt as a result of people who make decisions that shape the dominant narrative and are very exclusive in the way they run education, My book is about being the voice of the marginalized, the voice of parents with working class kids who have no power, the voice of working class grandmothers and grandfathers who have no power, the voice of disabled people, the voice of people who are alienated in society. So when I worked in the system, I made sure that in my office, everyone and anyone was welcome. And I would talk to people and discuss the issues. And when I did this, and I talked to people and I visited communities, poor communities, I decided that I have to write a book because no one will be able to articulate the messages and the feelings and the emotions and the ideas that these people have and the frustrations that they have. For example, and one of the factors, there are a few factors that shaped me writing this book. The first factor was that I grew up working class. And then for some reason or the other, I ended up being an academic, which is a very unusual thing, right? And then I said, well, if I become an academic, do I want to write articles in journals and chapters in books and become an important person? I don't think anyone is more important than the janitor, right? We're all equal people. So the point, what is in the book, what's been influenced by these factors that I just mentioned, as well as a very significant learning that I picked up that actually shaped the book entirely. I went into a rural area in the Western Cape, about 350 kilometers from Cape Town, and I saw a truckload of young boys and girls sitting at the back of the truck. So I went back to the place where I was staying and I asked the lady who runs the bed and breakfast, uh, who are these children in the back of the truck? And there's so many of them. She said to me that they work on the wine farm, and and then I thought, wow, these children are doing what their great grandparents, who were slaves, who were very poor people, who worked and toiled the wine farms, 150, 200 years ago, these children are doing the same thing today. And nobody says a word. And then I started going into the townships. Well, I've been going to the townships before that, but then I started going into the townships across the Western Cape, and I've been seeing similar things, that you have an education system and you have children who are totally disregarded, and the education system has got nothing to do with these children. So that's the main point that I introduced in chapter one. And in chapter two, I talk about the power of special education and why we don't make progress in inclusive education. That so much of time and energy and money and resources have been put into advancing a special education theory, which we don't do in inclusive education. And that's where academics and researchers need to do the work. And the next chapter I talk about, can a bureaucracy that's been developed and set up to maintain the status quo radically implement a radical concept of inclusive education? And I say in the book that I think it's impossible. It's impossible in South Africa. It's impossible in America. It's impossible in the UK. It's impossible in most countries in the world. Your bureaucrats don't get paid to think creatively and imaginatively. They get paid to maintain the status quo. And after that, I talk about a new model. And that new model, based on social justice, that will rupture the philosophy of education as it is at the moment, will rupture the structures, and will change the practices. That you have a new theory, you have new assumptions, you have a new model, you have new practices, and you have new tools that can create a truly inclusive education system that's based on love and humanity and respect for human dignity.
Very nice. Okay. Well, I've got my copy of the book, and I'm
I
reading
know.
through it. I'm reading through it. So I'm probably, once I read through it, you and I should probably get back here again and talk a little more. Um, so, okay, let me take 1 second here to give a little plug to the club. So, um, once again, my name is Ken Masson. I am the president of the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy, and we are working on a global level to work on basically advocacy for the human rights of people with disabilities. And so this is very appropriate to what we do. Anybody who's interested in getting involved in our club, we welcome you. We're in 23 countries right now. And I put the email address on here, though me with my dyslexia, I messed up not dyslexia, my ADHD, I kind of messed up the address here, but it's Rotary WDA, not GMA. It's gmail.com. So please write to us. We could use more people, the better. So, okay, we talked a little bit about the problem. Now let's kind of focus on some solutions, maybe. So let's see how would you advance empowerment and leadership in education?
Well, I think that we have to produce new knowledge because new knowledge changes consciousness. And when consciousness changes, thinking changes. So, what I think at the moment is that a lot of people um, are caught up by the system, and the system reproduces itself, it protects itself, and it will survive even if there's no people in the world because it'll find something to do. That's the way bureaucracies work. We need to change the bureaucracies. So we need to put thinkers into the bureaucratic system and change the nature and extent of the way it is structured. Because I think you need to have teams of people, project teams of people. You need to have people with a lot of disciplinary knowledge, because there's not a lot of disciplinary knowledge in the bureaucracy. Let's take a place like the United Kingdom, where there is such a huge body of sociological knowledge on inclusive education. I mean, it's just amazing the amount of knowledge that has been produced at a sociological level across the United Kingdom. It is a place that has started in many years ago. I can't find that. I can't remember the date. But what I can tell you is that these people had a class problem. It's 2025, next year. They haven't sorted the class problem out. I can say this publicly that I think young white boys in the United Kingdom who are working class don't have a chance. I've seen it. In some areas that I visited, the biggest problem was domestic violence. In the United Kingdom, that is able to give 63 million pounds to Syria, right? You have to ask the question, who is in charge of the country and who controls the narrative? If you look at the United States, you ask the same question. You have Donald Trump. His director of education is a wrestling executive. Now, then you have to ask the question, how is education being framed? How is education being constructed as a narrative? It has very little to do with humanity. It has very little to do with love. It has very little to do with people, and that's what I think we need to do. If we want to change the system, we need to produce knowledge that's based on love, that's based on care, and that should be the education narrative. And you look at Maslow's theory, there's enough love there because it tells you you'll never self actualize if you don't have your basic needs met. Every educator needs to know that. Every education planner needs to know that. If you have a place like the United Kingdom where you have such a big class problem, I don't think the word love ever emerges. Because I know when I was writing my book, I looked at Ofsted. Ofsted said that they have constructed or they have adopted the cultural capital principle, and the cultural capital principle emerges from Pierre Bourdieu's work on cultural capital and so on. I looked at the curriculum, it's got nothing to do with cultural capital. And so that's how people are fobbed off and dismissed because they think that the public are actually a bunch of fools. It's very unfortunate, but that's the way the bureaucracy treats the ordinary man in the street. I've seen it. They have no respect.
Mhm.
So, how do you change and how do you empower? You produce new knowledge and you let it be known that every child and every person matters. That should shape the narrative.
Interesting. You're referring to Maslow's hierarchy. And where does education fall on that? Because, I mean, at the bottom level is your basic things like food and water and health and all that kind of stuff. So if I'm not satisfying that need, how can I move up to education? That'd be important. You understand?
Yeah, yeah. That's why I say there's so much of love in Maslow's hierarchy because the basic needs have to be met, right? And so, why are so many people involved in drugs across the world? I mean, if you look at the United States, if you look at the UK, if you look at all these countries, drugs becomes a major problem. We have a society in chaos, and the society in chaos is largely a result of the education system
Okay.
because there's no care.
Okay. So we're basically talking about the public education system is part of the hope maybe found in the private education system.
Well, personally, this is my personal belief. I think private education is about the commodification of education. It's about money being put into education. And most poor people can't afford private education.
Hmm.
It's important for the public education system to realize what its deficiencies and weaknesses and limitations are. Because the only hope some person growing up in the township has, or in the ghetto has, is education. It's
Hmm.
the only hope.
Hmm.
And which child from a ghetto, which child from a township, which child from an informal settlement somewhere in the world can ever get private education? Private education is for the elite.
Okay. So just step back for a second. I'm curious how you got yourself out of the working class environment and into where you are today. I mean, it what happened in your life that got you to move to where you are today? That you were in a poor community, and oftentimes people remain in poor communities, but you we were able to move on from that community.
Well,
Was it luck or what?
so I think a lot of my life had to do with spirituality, and but the certain things that happened. For example, I was I was told once by a colleague or friend of mine that my results at school was not a reflection of my ability, because the teacher in the class in the school that we were at said to them in their class that I would have performed very well in that area that where I was living, and I didn't do that. But he told me this about 2 or 3 years later when I was in university. So that influenced me. The second thing that influenced me was being at the University of the Western Cape. The University of the Western Cape was in the apartheid struggle, the intellectual home of the left. And I met all these very bright academics that I got exposed to over a few years that were exceptionally bright and smart. And so they influenced me. But I think what the biggest influence in my life is my spirituality. And, I'll tell you this. So when we lived in Chatsworth in Durban, which is about 30 kilometers from the center of Durban in an Indian township, we were the way the apartheid system was structured was that your neighboring township would be African, because what they tried to do was they tried to divide and rule and create conflict between people. So one night, my mother, I was asked to speak at my mother's memorial service, at a funeral service, sorry, a memorial service. And I thought, what's the thing I remembered most about my mother? And I remember this incident where there were about 8 ladies, very poor ladies, who were selling brooms in our township. Brooms are the thing that you sweep the floor with.
Mm.
And their transport didn't come. And it was getting late and it was dark. And when I got up the next morning, I saw all those ladies sleeping in my lounge, in my house. That's the humanity my mother had. And that's what really made me think about that people are important. I think I was about 7 or 8 years old then, that every human being is important, rich or poor, educated or not. Because some of our most educated people are racist. Some of our most educated people have no respect for humanity. Some of our most educated people have contributed to the building of the nuclear bomb. That tells you about society.
And we could do a whole nother segment on that whole thing. Fascinating. And even the discussion about getting out of the poor community, is that a goal or no? The good thing about you, you went on and added depth to yourself, but you have not forgotten your roots. So I appreciate that very much. So let's talk about, is there hope? I mean, is there hope for change? And
Wow.
two-part question: is there hope for change? And if there is, how are we going to do it?
Well, there has to be hope, and I think we have to work towards a better society. And each one of us have to recognize the beauty of this universe, and that this universe is a special place for all of us. And if we really want to take care of this universe, then we got to take care of our brothers and sisters wherever they are. And those of us who are privileged, I consider myself a privileged person, that I have to use whatever resources I have to make other people hopeful, to create the conditions for people to be hopeful, not to judge people, but to have empathy, to have compassion, to realize that there's a universal design. that we human beings are different from any other species. We have an intellect, we have culture, and all those aspects of being human surely means that we can change the world, that we can have hope. And each of us have to make a difference in the lives of other people. But you have to start with your family. You have to start with your partner and with your children and your relatives, and that's where you start giving hope to people. You can't give hope to the world if you disrespect the people in your own house. And so I've learned that, and I think it's a very important part of my life. Is not to be judgmental, is not to be harsh, is to have compassion and care. And there are many people who do that. I know that. And there are churches across the world, there are mosques across the world, there are synagogues across the world, there are religious institutions across the world. All of them provide hope. So next week is Christmas. Jesus Christ was born poor. Jesus Christ suffered. But Jesus Christ gives hope to millions of people across the world.
So that would be a great point just to end here at this point, but I'm not ready to do that. So let me give you one more
Sure.
question. So basically, you're saying many things here, but one of the things I think that's important, and that's all part of the World Disability Advocacy Club, is advocacy. It's not easy to be an advocate. You can look at all the advocates in the world, and they've always been fighting resistance. And even in this improving the education system, there's going to be lots of resistance for the advocates to do that. What is your message to them to, I guess, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to not lose their focus and keep to their mission?
So when I ran the New York Marathon, it was the first marathon I ran in my life. I did many half marathons. I done like about 50 or 60 half marathons. When I came to the 37K mark, I remembered someone told me that there's 3 million people lining the streets of New York to watch the race. And there were a lot of people. I saw a lot of people. But at the 37K mark, I could not see anyone. It was me and that road and the finish sign. But I never gave up. It can get very difficult. I've been there and I know, because it's a shift in paradigms. It's a shift with the way people think, and it's a paradigm shift really. And so when I wrote my first book, it was about paradigm shifts. That you know, the collective good and the greater good is about a better humanity. There is no special place for people who are disabled or adults. There's no special place. It's a society that's inclusive. Schools should be inclusive. But we must do what is necessary to make this possible in our lives as individuals, and join organizations and help those organizations to grow and work as a collective. Have compassion for people, don't judge people, respect people, but make sure you're making progress with creating a better world. Because an inclusive world is a better world.
I think that's a good place to end. A good message for people to listen to as they also begin a new year and they want to be advocates, or they are advocates. That's a good message for them. And let's say this is part one of our discussion. I don't know how many more parts there is to it, but we will come back and we will talk specifically about some of the things that we were more generic here, more surface, but we need to get more specific into some of these things. So I thank you very much. Sigamoney. I'm very proud to have you as part of our club, and look forward to many, many more things happening with you and I and the club members, and advocacy. So,
No, thank you, Ken. I thank you for the time that you spent doing this interview, and the care and the dedication to advocacy and to inclusion. I really value what you do, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you. And I think that we need more people like you to make a difference in the world.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Okie doke, folks.
Thank you.
Rotary Club World Disability Advocacy. You want to come on board with us? RotaryWDA@gmail.com. We welcome you very much. So, see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks.